Pastor and writer James W. Moore gives a wonderful story from the days of the Old West when the major means of transportation across the country was the stagecoach. And we've seen persons riding in stagecoaches in Western movies. But what we might not know, says James Moore, is that the stagecoach had 3 different kinds of tickets: first class, second class, and third class. Now, if you had a first class ticket, well, that meant that you could remain seated during the entire trip no matter what happened. If the stagecoach got stuck in the mud, or had trouble making it up a steep hill, or even if a wheel fell off, you could remain seated because you had a first class ticket. But if you had a second class ticket, you could also remain seated until there was a problem. And in case of a problem, second class ticket holders would have to get off until the problem was resolved. You could stand off to the side and watch as other people worked. You didn't have to get your hands dirty. But second class ticket holders were not allowed to stay on board. When the stagecoach was unstruck or the wheel was fixed, you would get back on and take your seat. If you had a third class ticket, you would definitely have to get out if there was a problem, because it was your responsibility to help solve the problem. You had to get out and you had to push, or you had to lift to fix a broken wheel or whatever was needed, because you were only a third class passenger. Aren't you glad that we don't travel by stagecoach anymore? I'd hate to think about a bus. If you had a third class ticket on a bus, oh, we got a flat tire. Well, you got to get out and help fix the bus tire. One of the problems that the church is facing today is that we too have many people who think that they have first class tickets. Such people expect to be catered to, waited on, and of course pampered. And these people expect everything to go their way, and when things don't, well, they get upset. And you've probably noticed that sometimes in the church we have a few people who think that they're second class ticket holders. These folks ride along until there's a problem. They become detached spectators. Or they attend church regularly, but don't ask a person with a second-class ticket to get more than nominally involved, because they won't. Thankfully, we do have folks in the church willing to travel with a third-class ticket. We have some in our membership who are willing to get out and to push when things get tough. And being that it's Mother's Day, I think mothers know a lot about traveling on third-class tickets, because they have to be willing to step up and step in whenever they are needed. A pastor was talking with a man who was about to join the church, and the man said, "I want to join a church because I want to be fed." The pastor replied, "Well, that's fine, but we'd all be better off if you take off your bib and put on an apron." I think that pastor was getting tired of having members sitting in the first class section. I say all that to say this: the disciples had third class tickets. They were the ones who were charged with the responsibility of telling others the good news of Christ. And there are some things that Christ needed them to see, and that we need to see. And the first is that Christian faith always looks outward. Now, in some religions, the emphasis is on looking inward. It's what we call navel gazing. But that's not the primary focus of New Testament Christianity. We are a people called to look outward. Jesus challenged his disciples to be my witnesses to Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. He was calling his disciples to a great adventure. They were to leave their homes. They were to travel to the corners of the world proclaiming the gospel message. They were to look outward. Dr. Harry Ironside used to tell a story about a group of dissidents who left the church to become what they hoped would be the perfect church. This new congregation considered themselves to be such a spiritual blessing to God that they put a sign outside their church that said, "Jesus only." The church didn't reach out to their community, however. They only ministered to themselves. And one day, when Dr. Ironside went by the church, he noticed that the first 3 letters had fallen off the sign to reveal a new message: us only. The new message revealed the truth about that church's ministry. The Christian community is called to look outward. A young woman was asked if she would be interested in teaching a Sunday school class for youngsters, and her response was honest. She didn't feel like she was capable of teaching Sunday school, but there was something else she could do. She volunteered to recruit children and young people, so each Sunday morning she would fill up her car with children and young people who had no other means of transportation and bring them to Sunday school. And thanks to that woman's dedication, there were Sundays when the number of young people present were doubled. Unfortunately, there was also some grumbling that could occur when so many unattended children were present. There were some in the church who even thought that they should focus only on adults and not spend so much time on children and youth. Then some of the children's parents began to attend church. And one Sunday, when an invitation was given, one of the young people came forward with his younger brother, followed closely by their mother, and all 3 of them made commitments that morning to Jesus Christ. And before too long, this family was bringing other families. And eventually, most of those children and youth, and even some of their parents, had made decisions to follow Jesus. God used this woman who felt like she was incapable of teaching. God used her because she was happy enough to have a 3rd-class ticket. Followers of Jesus look outward. And followers of Jesus also look upward. Christ told his disciples to wait and pray. Wait and pray. That was then and this is now. And if we're honest about it, there's something about waiting and praying that goes against our nature. We don't like to wait for anything or anyone. We want immediate results with our satisfaction guaranteed or our money back. We want instant happiness. We want instant success. We don't want to wait for the good life. We want it now and immediately. And if we don't get what we want, we'll go look someplace else. Who wants to sit around and wait? Who wants to sit around and pray? I don't know if you noticed, but I took just a little extra time this morning on the silent prayer. How many noticed? It was only a few seconds. How many of you were getting a little worried? How many of you were wondering what's going on? Did Bob fall asleep? In his book, The New Art of Living, Norman Vincent Peale gave us an interesting picture of our modern situation. He tells about a man in London years ago who had regained his sight after having been blind since 2 years of age. Now, he could not remember his perceptions from his infant years, of course, but he had certain images in his mind about how people looked. For example, he imagined most people to be tall and slender. But the most startling image that he kept in his mind was that all human faces looked peaceful. Now, tomorrow morning, when you head out for work or to run your errands, I want you to look around and see if most of the people you see have peaceful expressions on their faces. My experience is that few people in today's world wear a peaceful expression. I heard about a lady who was riding a considerable distance on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Anybody ever do that? This was her first time, and that meant that she had to go through some long tunnels. And her son asked her how she enjoyed it, and she replied that one of them was 2.5. And what do you mean by that, he asked. Do you mean it was 2.5 miles long, or do you mean it was 2.5 minutes long, or what? She replied, no, it was 2.5 times through the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. There is a peacefulness that only waiting and praying can give us. There is also a power that only waiting and praying can give us. That's what the disciples discovered. Prayer and waiting are necessary preparations for the coming of the Holy Spirit. Followers of Jesus are to look outward, they're to look upward, and finally, they are to look forward. The apostles watched as Jesus was taken up in the cloud to heaven. They stood there looking up amazed at what had taken place, and suddenly two men in white robes stood before them and asked the apostles, "Why are you standing looking up toward the heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will return in the same way." Now, we didn't read what happened next in the morning text, but I'm going to tell you what happened next in Acts chapter verse 1. Starting in verse 12, it says, "Then they returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, Sabbath day's walk from the city. And when they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the son of the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. And they all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers." That's what happened next. They returned to Jerusalem. They went up to their upper room. They met together daily for prayer. They began to prepare themselves for what lay ahead. Billy Graham once told of visiting an elderly man who spent most of his life in China as a missionary. This former missionary had always enjoyed good health and was unusually a strong man. And his deep dedication to Christ and his love for his wife had made people love and admire him. He was a faithful witness. Unfortunately, this former missionary contracted cancer that spread through many parts of his body. And Billy Graham went to minister to him, to share words of comfort with him. Instead, this man witnessed to Dr. Graham. "There was a joy and radiance about him that I've rarely seen," Dr. Graham wrote. "He got up out of his bed and he walked me to the car when I left. And I shall never forget my last glimpse of him. With a great smile and a cheery wave, he said, 'Keep on preaching the gospel, Billy. The older I get, the better Christ is to me. The older I get, the better Christ is to me.'" I believe that that is the testimony of many Christians. Each day with Jesus is better than the day before. And the good news for today is that the best is yet to come. Jesus had not gone away. He had gone up. His disciples received the promise that one day he would return, and that's an important promise. For it says that this world is headed somewhere. It says that third-class ticket holders will one day see the fruits of their labors. It says that one day Christ will reign over all. Several years ago, a group of Christian musicians traveled to Russia to proclaim the gospel in word and music. They had the privilege of taking their talents to Moscow during the Russian Orthodox Easter. They met in the Palace of Congress where the Supreme Soviet had met for years. They met in a massive room with an enormous, oversized picture of Lenin hung in the front for all to see, except that day Lenin's portrait was covered. And in this massive hall, the gospel message of Jesus Christ was preached to a huge gathering of Christians and non-Christians alike. The hall was filled with majestic music, and Christ's message of forgiveness and grace was broadcast by television to millions of viewers throughout Russia. For the American Christians who made this trip, it was a service that they would never forget. And on Sunday afternoon, the group went into Red Square and distributed more than 100,000 pamphlets that told the message of Jesus Christ, including testaments and Bibles and languages of the Russian people. This is what's interesting. They were warned about doing that too aggressively. But not because the authorities opposed it, but because they might be mobbed by people starving for more information about Christ. I believe the response of those musicians received in Moscow is but a foreshadowing of the way that the whole world will one day move. There will come a time when Christ will rule over all. But in the meantime, as Christians, we are called to look outward, to look upward, and to look forward. Amen.